Good afternoon. My name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement at the Preschool Learning Alliance, and with me today is Melanie Pilcher, Quality and Standards Manager.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Our subject for today's webinar is the future of the early years foundation stage, scrutinising the proposed revised early learning goals. Hopefully you can see that title screen on your slide. If you can just give an indication with hands up, that would be great. When we were planning to deliver this webinar, we were kicking backwards and forwards ideas about the title. And so when I suggested the future of the early years foundation stage, Melanie did say, it's a bit apocalyptic, isn't it? And actually, on reflection, I think it's an appropriate title. As you'll see from the elements that we follow as we go through today's session, there are some fundamental elements of our understanding and principles of the early years foundation stage, which are influenced considerably by the proposed changes that are coming forward. And so, as ever, we will be very interested in your comments, questions as we go through, and we will try and weave those in through the debate that we have. Just to talk you through how that actually happens, I'll just move the slides on. For those of you who've been with us before or are new to webinars, don't panic. They are very similar to a normal seminar that I'm sure you'll have attended before, but these happen on the internet. It allows us to reach a lot more people across a wider area at the same time. Usually we talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. I think we'll break our own rule a bit here because there is so much content that we need to cover. And that we do allow time for question and comments at the end, but please don't wait to the end. You will be able to type a question at any time, and part of my role is to try and weave these seamlessly into the discussion as we talk. You should have that control panel to see, and it allows you to type in your questions in any of those languages. Please choose English, and we take it on from there. The way we're going to structure today is Mel will talk through some of the specific changes that have been proposed in the June publication, and then I will consider some of the wider implications of that for the sector. But clearly it's a dialogue that we will interchange as we go along, and also if you have any comments, please do feel free at any time to type them in. With no further ado, I'll hand over to Melanie.
Thank you, Michael. As always, we need to start by looking at the background to the proposed changes. So here's what we know at this point. So in June earlier this year, the DfE published the revision of the early learning goals and the early years foundation stage profile, and both of those documents were made public. In September 2018, so earlier this month, the draft version has started to be piloted in 25 schools, and this pilot will carry on until July 2019.
I had a search around on the web this morning to see if I could find out the list of the schools that are involved. I couldn't find it.
No, I haven't either. All we know with the schools that they were invited to put themselves forward for the pilot, and then they were selected on criteria such as their location, the size, and free school meal eligibility. So the DfE feel that they have got a good cross-selection for the pilot. During the pilot, there will be ongoing feedback from the schools, and at the end of the pilot, there will be an independent evaluation into how it all went. And then from July 2019, we're expecting consultation with the sector.
Do you know who's doing the independent evaluation?
Yes, Michael, I believe it's the Education Endowment Foundation, the National Centre for Social Research, and Action for Children, who will be involved in the independent evaluation.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on then. The rationale for the changes. So we thought it was working, so why go fix it if it isn't broken? And the DFE in their publicity have said that the measures are aimed at closing the word gap between disadvantaged children and their peers to help children who start school struggling with language and social skills. Meanwhile, the Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, has said, "We want to improve education for every child, and the early years in a child's life are critical in laying strong foundations for the future success." Of course, none of us would disagree with that. He also made it clear that they want to free up more time for reception teachers to interact with their pupils and make sure they're developing the rich vocabulary, skills and behaviours they need to thrive at school and later in life. Now, the initial response from schools and teachers has been cautiously optimistic, with some reservations. So the general feel of it is that the schools welcome some of the changes. They are pleased to see that the Minister is prioritising teacher workload, and that evidence gathering has been, as they said, the bane of teachers' workload for an awful long time now. Although, on the other hand, there have also been concerns over the initial review panel, which was said to have been very poorly represented from early years sector. So that has been a concern for everybody as well.
Okay, thank you.
The main focus of the changes then, let's have a quick look at those before we start to unpick them in a little bit more detail. So only the early learning goals have changed. We've been told that there will be no changes to the safeguarding and welfare requirements, but of course we know that there will be some changes because there have been certain policy changes such as disqualification by association, which will require some, so it makes sense that those
So this
will
is
be
used as a vehicle to bring forward some regulatory updates. Okay.
Yeah. The number of early learning goals remains at 17, and this had been one of the worries and concerns for teachers that the if they reduce the early learning goals, it would narrow the focus of the curriculum further. However, there are now 45 bullet points that replace the existing narrative that accompanies each goal. And of course, we know that as soon as we start seeing bullet points, we start seeing potentially tick boxes, which would be of concern to us. Each early learning goal is introduced by a paragraph explaining the importance of the subject and how educational programmes should be approached. And we'll be looking at those in a little bit more detail. But for example, communication and language talks about introducing new vocabulary through reading to children, engaging them actively in stories, non-fiction, rhymes and poems, and so on. Okay.
If I recall, in the current version, there is a single piece of narrative that introduces all of the early learning goals, not against each of the headings.
Yes.
That's correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
And whilst we, at first glance, would assume that the overarching principles of the EYFS remain the same, and some of the other changes may appear to be subtle, or supple maybe, as we bend them to our will, they do have implications for those providers who do embrace and uphold the principles of the EYFS. So we still have the fact that every child is a unique child, we still have positive relationships, we still talk about enabling environments. However, children develop and learn at different rates is now the final bullet point there, which used to say, quite importantly, that children develop and learn in different ways and at different rates.
I'll just interject here. I missed that when I first read them, and it was Melanie who brought it to my attention. And one of the things I meant to say by way of introduction was when we talk about how you need to make yourself knowledgeable about this process, it is imperative to read both documents as best you can against each other, because there are subtle nuances that we will have missed in today's presentation, because people were looking at it with fresh eyes. So it's not one of those things that you can do on a single read or alone. And actually having a discourse with colleagues with the Alliance to say, have you spotted there is a potential change to X, will be very valuable as we prepare for the consultation exercise. Definitely.
And as always with these things, the devil's in the detail, isn't it, as well? So looking at an overview, if we carry on with the overview of the early learning goal changes, the characteristics of effective learning, again, this was something that might have gone over our heads at a first glance. The characteristics have moved from the core principles to learning and development considerations, which seems to me to sort of downgrade them slightly.
I can add to that there was initial concern that they'd been taken out completely. However, clarification has come from the department that they do remain statutory requirement. But as you say, the proposal is that they are moved into a factor for learning and development considerations.
Yeah. And there are some new headings, and some of the goals have expanded, some have changed. There's changes in terminology used, and one of the things that struck me is that there seems to be a change in the tone of the EYFS, and it has certainly become more functional and technical. And for any of you that have got your under 5, was it in last month, Michael, or in this month?
September is the first article, and October is the second.
So as your under 5 magazines will be landing on your desks shortly, you will see that we've done 2 articles, or Michael's done 2 articles, which actually look at the changes and the implications in more detail. And this is one of the things that I picked up from your article, Michael, that you said about the very functional and technical language that's being used. And throughout, there is this repeated emphasis on reading books and listening to stories. And we know, as we've heard from the head of Ofsted, and we've heard from others about the worries about children's levels of communication, language and literacy when they actually starting at school. But that going back to that functional and technical tone, I do think that is so at odds with the EYFS as we've come to know it.
Okay.
So let's look at each goal then in a little bit more detail now. And again, the slides would be very busy and very full. This would be a much longer presentation if we looked at the very detail of every single one. So for communication and language, it's been narrowed down to 2 areas, listening and speaking. Attention's been removed completely, and the term understanding has been reworked as comprehension. So the feeling is that the overall focus appears to be on the child receiving the teacher's input in a correct manner, rather than being enthusiastically engaged. And the other worry has been as well that the draft goals in their current form are not based on the extensive research evidence about how children learn language. So this worries us greatly. Speech and language experts themselves have shown that these are vital components to children's development of language, and they're gone.
Okay. Thank you.
And for personal, social and emotional development, again, a few changes. Health and self-care elements previously in physical development have been moved into personal, social, emotional development, and again have become much more functional in their tone. So we have these 3 areas here: self-regulation, managing self, and building relationships. I'm still struggling myself with using terms like self-regulation as an early learning goal, but I'm still trying to get my thoughts in order about that, and talking to colleagues about that this afternoon, actually.
It does raise a question about whether somebody else can assess whether you can self-regulate.
Exactly, yes, yes. And then we've got physical development. So moving and handling element is now articulated as gross and fine motor skills.
Okay.
There is no reference to children understanding the importance of physical exercise, although developing a love of physical exercise is mentioned in educational programmes. And again, we could argue, couldn't we, about the difference between understanding the benefits of doing something and actually loving doing it.
Trying to get my nephew to love physical exercise will be a labour of Sisyphus. I think it's not going to happen.
Yes, I think there are going to be some challenges along the way with that one. And then we move on to literacy.
Sorry.
That's okay.
That was a prompt to me.
And we now have comprehension, reading, writing. And again, the new requirements are much more specific. So, for example, say a sound for each letter in the alphabet and at least 10 digraphs. Hands up, people like me who had to look at what a digraph was.
I had to look up a digraph, yes.
In the first place. But obviously those are the sort of joining letters, the ch and so on. So again, if we move on, I think we might come back to that later and talk a little bit more. But mathematics, now this is having, well, as somebody that represents early years on a mathematics group, I know that this is an area that's causing a lot of concerns. As with the other early learning goals, the tone is very much more functional and has caused a lot of concerns, as I said. The big one, space, shape and measure, has been removed completely.
Yes.
Subitize has been added.
I had to look that up.
We had to look at subitize. And
it's a question out to everybody. Can you first want to write back what subitizing actually is, please?
Oh, there we go.
Somebody, yes, Louise has asked, subitize, what is that? Well, I'll put the question out to anybody else before we give you the answer.
Again, it's that technical language that is at odds with some of us in early years. We probably all know what it is, but we don't recognise the word.
There is no prize for this, by the way, but just be interested to see who comes back first. You're all quickly Googling it.
Yes, they are. And understanding of number 1 to 10, which was previously 1 to 20, which I think has been welcomed by some in terms of, you know, that children really need to get to grips with those numbers early on.
Okay, before I change the slide, Melanie, I'm afraid
Yes.
nobody's come back quickly. Please explain what subitize
I
is.
was really hoping you weren't going to say
It's
that.
being able to spot or identify the number of items in a group without having to count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Thank you. Which again is something that we know. It's that sort of estimating, isn't it? Being able to look at a group of objects and saying, "Oh, that there's 5 there," without yes. But we shall see. Okay. Thank you. Then we come on to understanding the world, and as you can see, very little change is made to understanding the world. However, a use of technology has been removed.
Yes, that does seem unusual in a 21st century environment to actually remove explicit reference to technology as one of the skills and experiences and knowledge that young children should develop.
Now, actually, I would rather have seen that clarified better, because technology was always problematic, because technology encompasses a wide range of things, not just IT, information and communication technology. Technology is more about tools and so on, or incorporates that as well. And I always wish that they would clarify that. But to solve the problem completely, they've removed it. So that takes it away completely.
Can I just give you this?
Yes.
Nicely from Alison is the best descriptor of subitize I've heard. She describes it as the 5-ness of 5, and I love that.
Oh, I like that.
I shall use that myself. Thank you, Alison.
Brilliant, thank you. So does Alison get the prize?
She does. There is no prize.
Thank you. A free shout out on the webinar as your prize, Alison. And then we come on to expressive arts and design. Again, I do have some issues with it. Being imaginative has been replaced with performing.
Yes.
And that's not a word I like, that suggestion that children can be taught something and then perform it rather than draw on imagination and interpretation.
And I think that one of the concerns I have with that is it seems to change who the early learning goal is for.
Yes.
It's not, performing implies that it's not necessarily for the child, him or herself, but it's for the audience looking on for whom the performance is made. And that seems unusual.
Mm-hmm. That again, it takes away from the characteristics of effective learning, that how rather than what. To me, if you're performing, you're proving that you've achieved a set task.
And it also, I'm just thinking as I speak here, it seems to reflect back that period we had where it was perfect pictures being put on the wall, which had clearly been influenced or strongly done by the practitioner rather than by the child themselves, that actually the end product is perceived as more important than the actual process and the engagement and the learning that took place.
Yes, thank you, Mike.
Just a comment from Sharon about the technology. I suppose there is an expectation these days that everybody uses and understands technology, which I think is a fair point, Sharon. And that may be the justification, but as I say, it's one of those circumstances where the explanation for any of the alterations have not been given. We're presented with the end product.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said before, that broad definition of what we mean by technology as well.
And Louise has made the comment in terms of performing seems quite a narrow concept
Yes.
versus being imaginative.
Yeah.
I agree absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so there we go. That's it in a nutshell. So why are we so worried about this then? Let's think about it.
Thank you. What follows on the next 2 or 3 slides summarises much of the territory that Melanie has walked us through, but it also links, if you don't mind me, with a couple of questions that have come through that I'll add in as we speak on this one. But the first one came through from Zoe. In the early learning goals are at the end of reception, so what impact will they really have on me as a nursery provider? And that was where I started with this, because that question has been put to us. Yeah. Why worry? Yes, the early learning goals are assessed when the child starts school, so it does not affect the early years sector. I would strongly disagree with that, because if you change the desired product, then you influence the process that gets people to support the children to achieve that product. The early years foundation will still have an expectation that the early years has a school readiness element, so that children are ready to go to formal schooling. By definition, that puts pressure down on the curriculum of what is delivered in the early years setting. So whilst we may not be doing the assessment in our sector, clearly there will be pressures down to influence what it is we actually do in our setting.
It will, of course, influence your education programmes, undoubtedly.
Yes, of course. And I think that links on to the question that came through from Margaret on a similar topic. When the new early learning goals are introduced, will Ofsted give us time to embed them before inspecting us on the new areas of learning and development? Again, Ofsted, as we understand it, will still be inspecting the effectiveness and the quality of the early years foundation stage provision. And if that means, and that will include the revised early learning goals, so there will be an expectation on Ofsted's part, I assume, that actually you will be demonstrating that the teaching you are providing for the children leads towards those early learning goals. So there will be that expectation that the curriculum changes.
Yes, yeah, I agree, Michael. And as before, when we have seen changes to the EYFS, you know, that we are given some lead in time as a sector. Sometimes it's shorter than others. And generally the expectation is that you will be ready to go and you will be up and running with them as and when they are introduced.
Yes. People are reading down my slide and been questions before I got there, so I shall try and catch up if you don't mind. But making reference back again to the opening slide about the removal from the overarching principles of learn differently, I think that fundamentally sets the alarm bells ringing, because we know evidence supports it and best practice supports it. Children's early learning is not a linear process, and each child is different in how and when they learn. So to remove that from one of the principles of the curriculum which defines our work, I think is inherently concerning. And I think when we get to the consultation approach, that needs to be challenged vigorously. Also, the downgrading, for want of a better phrase, of the characteristics of effective learning. We could be accused of being melodramatic and it doesn't really matter. But if it didn't matter, why do it? I think would be the challenge there. Why move it at all? Unless there is a particular reason for doing so. And Louise has made a comment in terms of the next reference there. The primacy of learning through books. If you don't mind, I'll just read out a couple of the early learning goals as I have them in front of me. In the past and present early learning goal, children should know some similarities and differences between things in the past and now, drawing on their experiences and what has been read in class. They should also recall some important narratives, characters and figures from the past encountered in books read in class. In the natural world early learning goal, children know similarities and differences between the natural world around them and contrasting environments, drawing on their experiences and what has been read in class. Now, none of this is to deny that young children's engagements with books is important, or that stories are a vital part of early learning and development. But the subliminal message is that the central element of children's early learning should be books. And this is wrong. Young children develop best through being active agents in their learning, exploring and experiencing the world, either on their own or with their friends. They reflect on those experiences with their peers and with the adults who are important to them. That's how children learn. It is supplemented by books, but it is not driven by books. Also, Louise has added to that by saying the primacy of learning through books. I'm worried that this statement sets EAL children up at a huge disadvantage.
Oh, gosh, yes.
I couldn't agree more, Louise. And the comment from Alison on all of this is you have to plan backwards in order to fit in the required provision to enable an expected outcome. I think you're right. This will have implications for what we do. So thank you for those. And also the point Melanie has made in terms of maths without context. You learn volume, you learn shape, you learn angles through enjoyment of the context in which they occur. If you make it a purely technical exercise, that's how we lose children in primary school from mathematics. To do it even earlier seems an unhelpful development, I would suggest. Also, back to the point made earlier, the bullet point format. To their credit, DFE said they would not change the 17 early learning goals, and they didn't. However, what we now have is a series of about 45 sub-learning goals. And also, when they were originally presented in the current version of the early years foundation stage, it's an interesting analysis of explaining what teachers should look for. It was examples given to help them during the assessment process at the foundation stage profile element. If you now make them into a series of individual bullet points, as Melanie indicated, it lends itself naturally towards a tick box assessment of what children can and cannot do. And the biggest concern here is that, in effect, it's a vehicle for introducing baseline assessment through the back door. Colleagues will be aware that this has been something attempted and is still being attempted, even though it's proven each time to be unworkable and against children's best interests. But the changes to the early learning goals could be a different way of skinning that same cat. Oh, sorry. And finally, why worry overarching? I strongly take the view that this implies a redefinition of the skills and abilities that are considered desirable in our young children, and by extension, the type of people they are expecting to become. As Melanie said, the change from understanding to becoming reading comprehension and taking away being imaginative and replacing it by performance just neutralizes childhood. Yes, I would suggest. It takes away all the joys of being a child. And the direction of travel is away from children being the active agents in their own learning and development. We regularly at the Alliance get international visitors who are genuinely interested in the articulation of the early years foundation stage that we now have. For years we've been playing catch up with other countries, believing that their system of early years provision is in advance of ours. I think over the last 10 years, since 2008 and the introduction of the early years foundation stage, we've reversed those tables, and many international commentators and practitioners come and speak to us about the EYFS. I think that primacy and articulation of a very good, balanced child-led and adult-led curriculum is really under threat by this development, and it concerns me hugely. Just a couple of comments as we've been going on, and Lourdes, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm a childminder and would like to know if the terminology for our jobs could be changed to something like early years practitioner, at least, as our current name does not do us any justice. I think that's an important point on here, because it's never, the childminding phrase has been a difficult one, and clearly as we move towards changes towards the early years foundation stage as it sits at the moment, that role of a professional function should really be reflected in all early years practice, no matter where it's delivered. So I think there's a strong case to pursue that.
Yes, I agree with that.
And Zoe, what is the general feeling about the chosen evaluators? Are they the right organisations for the job? that's a wider concern about who does the assessing, Zoe, and I think it's an interesting one. And I think one of the concerns has always been in the foundation stage profile in terms of standardisation across schools and across local authorities. And also the fact that the aim of the foundation stage profile, as it's explained to us, is to identify the distance travelled by children when they leave at the end of Key Stage 2. So the allegation and the charge has always been made, well, isn't it in the interests of those doing the assessment to assess negatively? I won't put it any more strongly than that. But clearly, the counter-argument to that, however, would be, are you arguing that we should have a national SATS at stage 4, because that way we would have a national approach to what's going on, and I think that way would lead to equal numbers of challenges and concerns, etc. Assessment should be there primarily to make sure we develop an individual learning program that helps each child succeed. Beyond that, aggregating up of scores or anything else really is not in the child's best interest. Right, so what? Next steps. I'd be interested to know how many of you attending knew about the early learning goals in advance of today's webinar, whether you'd read the information or not, or you've used this as the opportunity to get your head around it for the first time. So if you haven't, the URL on the screen there is where you can locate the document, or just do a Google search, it's fine. As Melanie indicated, there are a series of 2 articles in the under 5, one in September and the October editions, and it really is incumbent on everybody to get themselves up to speed and very knowledgeable about the proposed changes in advance of the consultation, which we understand will be next July. A couple of questions that have come in while I've been talking, and it's Alison and Chloe have said the same one, so I'll read one of them. What will happen to development matters and the early years outcome when the new early learning goals come in?
Yeah, we haven't heard of any plans to change it, and personally, I don't think there will be any plans to rewrite those. Of course, those are 2 guidance documents, supporting documents, and there have always been concerns from the authors of those documents that people have taken them and used them as a tick list, which they were never intended to be. So personally, I don't think that they will change. I think they still have some value, even with the new early learning goals. But
presumably, I'm just thinking back to the age ranges, the best fit elements may well be fine, but when we get to the 60 months and the final early learning goal, presumably that will be affected. Yeah.
But whether they will actually go to the trouble of actually introducing or issuing new supporting documentation or not, I don't think they will myself, but we will see.
Okay, thank you for that. I hadn't thought that through. Yeah. That's very helpful. Thank you. Right, that's all from us at this side. I hope you found that of use. I will just witter on endlessly for a period of time just to see if there are any more questions or comments coming through from the audience today. But I won't artificially extend the exercise. So it just remains with me to say thank you to Melanie for her hard work in dissecting.
Thank you.
And it probably was a dissection,
yes.
The new wording. It's not the easiest of tasks to read one document against the other because they're not a mirror of each other. So you do have to read it several times, but it is incumbent on everybody to do so because we do need to make our voice heard. Ruth is saying her thanks to us. I appreciate that. Thank you, as does and Sharon as well. So unless there are any other comments, I will say thank you all of you for joining us today and for your contributions, and goodbye.